That was great. So we met Andy. We're never going to forget Andy and his scooter, and Ruben. We also have David Kramer from the Ford Emerging Technology Division from Ford Motor Company. So let me just get started with our question and answer period by asking David, can you talk a little bit about the challenges and opportunities about mobility as a service, and maybe even in a larger sense, the evolution that Ford might be going through as we move from buying a car to perhaps renting one for a few minutes?
Sure. So at Ford, we see this as a huge opportunity for us. The auto industry in general, it doesn't make a lot of a profit margin off of the vehicles themselves. It's primarily driven by financial services and service and repair, spare parts, that sort of revenue streams are what really generates the bulk of the profits within the company. So the mobility as a service opportunity is that now we can generate revenue sources from a wide variety of different types of services through subscriptions and so forth, and branch out beyond just typical moving people from point A to point B. So for example, you're sitting in your vehicle, what if we could give you a health report at the end of your ride? Different types of services that we've never traditionally been in a part of. So there's a whole lot of additional opportunities for us, and those opportunities don't cost as much as it does to build a plant or to build a warehouse or to tie up a lot of money in stock that's in those warehouses. So what we see is this is a huge opportunity for us to not only increase our profitability, but also to help bring the streets back to the people. So as was mentioned, right now we've got a lot of congestion, we've got a lot of retail businesses and small businesses within cities that people can't get to because there's too much congestion and people don't want to go out on the weekends because they're going to be stuck in traffic, all these mindsets. How do we bring that back so that the people want to go out into the streets and use the amenities that the cities afford? And so this is a great opportunity for everyone involved.
Thanks, David. This clearly is a fascinating topic. There's a lot there, though. If I'm a city, and Ruben, maybe this is a question for you and for Andy, what do I do first? Can you really talk about somewhat of a formalized planning process, or how formalized is it? I know you have some US DOT roads, and they have a very structured systems engineering process of user needs and consensus-based user needs, measurable requirements, and test plans. But the rest of this, not so much. Can you talk about the integrated planning process of all of this?
I want to hear you.
You want to hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the non-structured part of it is I guess it's the chicken or the egg. What comes first? One thing that I've gotten pushed back on, and it's really kind of a generational thing between millennials and baby boomers, and I know there are baby boomers out there that are all gung-ho, but really when you look at, we get a lot of pushback. Nobody bikes. Biking is not a mode of transportation. So really, with the launch of this rideshare program, it's going to give us data. And so the idea of it being is that we have low-speed roads throughout where this bike share system is going to go. And by launching it, I'm hoping to use this real-time data to really build a case for expansion of the system and to build that case that this is a mode of transportation. It's from point A to point B. It's not going out for a joyride. It is meant to facilitate that last and first mile. So as far as a formal planning process from the city, we've gone through and we've identified areas that we believe are good launch points for this. But my hope is, without changing our infrastructure dramatically because of our low speeds, that this will be a good fit for the historic urban area. And then as the program progresses and we're actually getting data of where we might find that there's two hubs that have great connectivity, and there's a lot of activity from this hub to this hub. So we might look at those paths and then start to plan for better facilities, separated facilities between those 2 points. But it is we are moving forward in more of a unstructured way to see. One thing I do like with the Gotcha's platform is that it's mobile. It's not infrastructure that's permanently there, so we have the opportunity to adjust the system as we see users and how they're interacting with it.
Well, the reason I led off with that question is because usually these initiatives tend to be the pet project of an elected official. And you had remarked that this bike situation bubbled up. Who did it bubble up from?
Well, it bubbled up from me. In evaluating, my task was to improve mobility with the city of St. Augustine, and through that improve livability in the city of St. Augustine. And one of those first items that was available was a rideshare program that we do not have, and that makes all the sense in the world when you look at our city and how it's connected, where we have a historic town plan where all of our commercial and retail restaurants are surrounded by old historic neighborhoods that are within a mile to a mile and a half of the downtown area. It does have support from our city commission, but one of the other initiatives with this too is also promoting a healthy lifestyle. The bike share program itself enables another system to get around that is also a benefit to our community from a health perspective as well. And one thing we're doing is working with sponsors in the city to actually sponsor and help fund the program. And one of our big, hopefully big sponsors is going to be our local hospital, because there's benefits with that as well. And Gotcha tracks, number of miles biked, calories burned, emissions reduced, so there's a whole lot of other things that the program has to offer that pinged on creating a more livable city.
Can I pile
Go ahead.
on? Your first question about paralysis by analysis, I think that's a really important one, because Ruben's not alone, where cities all over the country will get hung up on thinking ahead to, the planning department's going to have this opposition, or this elected official is going to have that opposition. So there's always a reason that someone's thinking ahead why something's not going to work. The magic with any form of mobility project is just like anything else. You got to figure out who all the different types of stakeholders are, and then back to what I was saying before about interest versus position statements. So finding out parents of kids want their kids to be healthy. They want their kids to be able, especially in a tightly knit area like St. Augustine, let their kids be able to walk and ride bikes to school. Something simple like that. So there's that group of people that someone can begin just having conversations about it and asking questions, and what is it that you need? And then there's another group, business owners. They need to make money or they're going out of business. So separately, you're talking to those people. So I think you got to have a bunch of chickens laying eggs all at the same time. If you take that analogy even further, I think what we do as cities and consultants working with cities is we get overwhelmed by all the things, and if we're thinking chicken and egg, we're thinking, well, who's gonna pick up all these eggs and who's gonna package them? We gotta line up the grocery stores and the vendors. You're thinking about all these things rather than it's just some of the fundamentals, like talk to the different people that are involved at every part of that chain along the way. And then before you know it, just like the tactical urbanism projects where you experiment, and then if it doesn't work as well as you thought, you you didn't spend a fortune on it. You did some low cost, quick options, and then you adapt.
What was interesting to me, and I don't know what slide presentation had the sustainability in there. Sustainability has three pillars: preserving or enhancing the physical environment, the natural environment, preserving and enhancing human quality of life, safety, livability, all of those things. But the third is the one that's always forgotten, which is doing so in an economically reasonable manner. Because if you can't do the third, the first two are never going to happen either. And that economically reasonable manner is also the economic vitality of the city itself. Because if you can't get people to work or to go out to the restaurant, you're gonna suffer. Do we have a question back there?
Colton Bond of Savannah River Nuclear Solutions.
We want to hear you. We do.
It says it's on. Oh, test. Okay. So Colton Bond of Savannah River Nuclear Solutions, but this more or less comes as a personal question. You talk about the power struggle between millennials and boomers. And as a millennial, my favorite and easiest form of transportation is longboarding or skateboarding. I can get there relatively quick. I get good exercise. And if I'm going through a crowded pedestrian area, I can just step off and carry it, as opposed to pushing a bulky bike. I don't have to worry about locking it up. And I hear all this talk about making access for bicycles. And to me, like, I feel skateboarding is a superior form of transportation, but I may be biased towards that. And skateboarding always seems to get the short end of the stick. Do you see any change coming to that with urban development? And if not, why?
I've got things to say. Do you want to talk?
You go first.
First, the only reason why I don't skate is I have terrible balance. So that's why I'm biased with bikes and consider myself part of the all-powerful bike lobby. That said, there is a rub. You're absolutely right that this is not just your own perception. There is a real problem in the bicycle and pedestrian planning world with this, because we'll get hung up, again, in the weeds of the design details and forgetting that issue, that higher level issue of interest versus position statements. So I can't tell you how many times over the years in designing bicycle infrastructure, like bike lanes, protected bike lanes, where I, as someone who's not riding a skateboard, I know in terms of speed differential, I want all those things together. I want bicycles, skateboards, electric scooters, they're all going about the same speed. And when it comes to traffic safety, the real danger is when you have a big speed differential. So that's why we don't walk on the interstate, or if we do, it's only in an emergency. It's the exact same concept with skateboards. And I think there are a couple of reasons why that's happened. I mean, some of it is just cultural, where for the same, I mean, some of the things like that overlap skateboarding, punk rock, graffiti, like all that fun, I think it's fun, all that fun subcultural stuff. There's part of us as an American society that's like, I don't know about skateboards. When you bring in skateboards on bike lanes, doesn't that mean more tattoos? And are tattoos bad for business? Like, there's all these things that we have in the back of our minds that we don't say out loud. So I think it just comes down to the basics of communicating what the need is. I'm getting from this place to this place, and I'm going about this speed. And it's hard work because it's one conversation at a time. It's understanding it's not going to be an overnight switch, but you're absolutely right that in terms of space and where you should be, bike infrastructure and skating infrastructure should overlap. It's a great way. And another reason why it's great is it's even easier for younger kids to skate than it is to have to worry about bringing their own bicycles and locking them up.
I'll jump on that it's actually the policy of the U.S. Department of Transportation to include all stakeholder communities if you want federal funding. Federal highway funding covers all the way down to numbered county roads. So I'll put the onus back on the skateboard community to identify themselves as a group of stakeholders so that when these studies are done and the systems engineering is done, they have a voice. Because typically the bike people talk, the pedestrians, the business community, and all kinds of other people.
Yeah, one quick phrase before Ruben says something more important. A phrase to use, non-motorized transportation. Non-motorized transportation, because that way you're not making yourself sound like an elite other. You are absolutely part of the fundamental modes of transportation, non-motorized transportation. Sorry, go ahead, Ruben.
And just one point of clarification, are you talking about like a skateboard share program where there'd be skateboards at hubs that people could rent and go from point A to point B, or just personal use of your own skateboard as you choose to go through the city?
I personally just have a personally owned one, but I don't know why an electric skateboard share couldn't exist.
I can, from the city's perspective, I would have heartburn of anybody being able to walk up and rent one and not knowing. Skateboarding takes a certain level, a certain skill level. My perspective for the city of St. Augustine and tourism economy is you have a lot of visitors coming. Somebody could rent a skateboard and then get injured. So that's one aspect of it. But the non-motorized trail, which we were discussing, so we're thinking of infrastructure projects that would be suitable for not just, I mentioned scooters and bikes, but also for skateboards as well. That whole idea of that slow vehicle lane would be for it would be a mixed use. Pedestrians stay on the sidewalk. The slow speed lane is kind of the mixture for everybody else outside of the personal motor vehicle. So that's like a 15 mile per hour or less. And then the next step up would be your 20 to 25 mile an hour roadway for a motor vehicle. So it's a good question. We have in the city of St. Augustine Flagler College. So we have a lot of college students that their favorite mode of transportation is skateboarding back and forth. So it's also a great way to get around.
Let's redirect this to the technology. So in my conversations with autonomous vehicle companies, shuttles particularly, they quite openly describe themselves as simply rolling sensor platforms that simply carry people. And that in the long term, it's going to be that data that gets monetized. So what data gets collected? What can you do with it?
I'll start, but mine's not. My particular data is not going to be quite as robust. But what we do with vehicles is we're tracking vehicles. We are not interested in following the owners around and then selling their information. I'm not putting a moral statement on that. Just that for our programs, that's how we're doing it. So what's important for us Ruben mentioned earlier about how our equipment is mobile. What that means is that we don't have to build kiosks and expensive infrastructure to have hubs. Our bikes lock to racks. Same thing with the scooters. So they're organized and locked. The technology for us is all inside those little vehicles. So when you check out a bicycle or you check out a scooter, bike is a good example because it's got extra features that we can connect with data. But everything is right in there. We can follow the path of the bicycle throughout. So that does a few things. It tells us how far a bike is being ridden and in the time that it's being ridden, so we can calculate how fast that person's going, and then we can translate that into how many calories are burned. We can do a couple of other things, just in broad strokes. If a bike moves at a certain speed, what that means. We can also share that with, or I say share, they've got access to a dashboard as if they were an extension of our staff, just to get a better idea when they're implementing a long-range transportation plan or a small urban area study where they can see, why is it that everyone's on Carey Street instead of Main Street? We thought this would be the bicycle-friendly street. So they can go out and observe conditions that they might not have noticed otherwise, just based on the patterns of how people are riding bikes. And then another one is hubs, to be able to see, I want to think that I'm going to be right the first time when I say where a bike hub should be. It turns out I'm not always right the first time. So we can see there are a lot of people that want to be going to this corner of town, and we're not serving very well with hubs. So we can take that data and say, all right, we need to have a hub. Something's going on over here, and we can dig a little bit deeper. So for us, it's about how people are moving, so that we can then, with the city, we're not the ones building infrastructure, but we can be sharing that with our city counterparts and say, here's an opportunity to make robust bike infrastructure. There are a lot of people that are trying to get over here, and you need some stronger networks of bike connectivity and things like that. So that's the type of data that we're really interested in. It's a little bit different than some of the others.
So Andy, let me ask. I'm sure the Traffic Management Center in St. Augustine has all this ITS compliant hardware, that the dynamic message signs and the traffic signals and vehicle counters and all kinds of things come to one large user interface. You're a bit of a proprietary system. Do you have an open API that would allow them to eventually integrate the bike or scooter traffic flow patterns and overlay it with their other transit information?
So you're talking to the guy that loves to use apps and knows what APIs are, and then the rest of the technology whoosh, goes right over me and to coworkers. But my lay term response to that is, we absolutely want to be incorporated in people's kind of catching of options apps. I think if that's what you're asking.
Well, actually, it's more for I'm anticipating that I'm going down the path of IoT and the management system and the long-term viability of this, and even the economic viability. I know that the city of St. Augustine has someone there with a large user interface, probably an SNMP network management tool, that is looking at traffic signal anomalies, looking at cars stacking up at turn lanes and things like that. And if I was that person, I sure would like to know where these bikes are aggregating and where are they going in different times of day and all those kind of things. Ruben.
It's very important for our vendors, and I know talking with Gotcha that this is available, to have that open API that we can aggregate that data to our command center. We have two. Actually, the city itself doesn't have its own transportation command center because of our size.
Okay.
But our county, and then we have a master TMC command center at the TPO in Jacksonville. And so building on that, the idea of our TPO in the smart region is to have open APIs that they have access to in their command center. And part of the Smart Region initiative is to go a step further in developing an integrated data exchange that could aggregate even data outside of transportation into it, and have that open and accessible to private sector, because there's an acknowledgement that even though I think that I'm a fairly smart person, there's probably somebody out there smarter than I that can maybe do something with the data that we have didn't even think about. So it's really important as we move forward that we're making this data open and available, not just to a traffic command center, but to private sector and public as well.
It's interesting what you mentioned about, I live in Florida, and there are very open public records laws. Just about everything's online. Just about everything. In many sessions this week, we've talked about who owns the data, who by default should own the data. So what's your perspective on that?
I can tell you that outside of personal information, that we've had long discussions back and forth with our city attorney, but outside of certain areas that's deemed not public record from under the Sunshine Law in Florida, right. The city's perspective is that everything is outside of that realm is public data. So when we contract with Gotcha, when we contract with another vendor providing these services, our perspective is that the data being generated is actually the city's data, and therefore public data after that.
So are you envisioning an open portal where someone with an open API where any of us could go and write an app that does some data analytics on where the bikes are or other things?
That would be the idea, the end goal with not just the cities, but like I said, our regional smart region initiative with an integrated data exchange would be an open portal where anybody could go in and cull through data, and not just transportation, but for instance, an example would be looking at building permits issued or land use and water usage, and look at that in regards to transportation systems as well, and see what can come of it. The big question is that or the big idea is that we don't know, but having that data openly and readily available is one of the things that we've identified as being a key to our smart region.
Yeah,
and it's getting that private sector buy-in to it as well.
That question makes me think too, just a very basic thing, like especially on the land use planning side, if a developer is thinking about putting a new restaurant in downtown and they're not sure which block, we know, I mean, this has been studied for decades, that bikes are good for business. If they were to be able to look at where people are actually riding bikes in parking hubs and see which are the busiest hubs and know there's a lot of foot traffic there, that means a lot of dollars spent in that block potentially, then that can draw someone in when, years ago and up until now, they're having to do a lot of work on their own, asking questions, attending meetings, digging through reports to find out just anecdotally where people riding bikes or walking downtown would want to go. Now, if they're able to access that kind of data, they can see this is a busy area for bike share. I sure want to get some of that foot traffic into my business. So we know it's good for our business because even more people would be riding bikes.
Well, I'm not a commercial real estate person. I do know that very often, if you look at to lease commercial property, it's often based on vehicular traffic levels. And I could imagine a scenario here where there could be a number of layers to that, of bike traffic, of pedestrian traffic, and of skateboard traffic. David, you've done some smart parking work, haven't you?
Yes.
Is that something you might want to talk about a little bit?
Sure. So, but in general, as far as data is concerned, being the IoT guy at Ford, I refer to the vehicle as the ultimate IoT device with the data center on board. Gives us a lot of opportunity, and yes, there's sensitivity. Every driver, for example, has a different unique style, so you could personally identify a individual driver based on how they move the steering wheel and accelerate and decelerate and so forth. But we take that very seriously and protect that data. It's more for our understanding of safety. That's first and foremost. We want to make vehicles that are safe, but also the customer experience. The customer experience is also important to us. So example, in a ride-sharing situation, when one customer leaves the vehicle and the next customer comes in, you want to make sure that that experience is positive for the next customer and there's no putrid smells left behind or artifacts or graffiti and so forth. So you can imagine the number of sensor technologies that we have in the vehicles to accommodate certain things like this. Example, in China, where there's high smog levels, we're able to detect the air quality outside the vehicle and inside the vehicle and change the air recirculation damper to give the customer the best air quality experience inside the vehicle. That and understand, conditions like CO2 levels in the vehicle. If there's too much CO2 in the vehicle, that can make you more drowsy, and so we can introduce better air quality in that way, and or send early alerts faster than normal to keep the driver safe. So that's where we're really interested in the data aspect, not so much to capitalize off the individual nature of people's privacy and so forth. But as far as parking, some of the initiatives that we've looked into are situations like in large cities where you have curbside parking. You may have a group of businesses who have come together and agreed that this one spot on the curb is designated for the delivery truck, and just everybody there knows and accepts, don't park in that one space, because at 2 o'clock on Tuesdays, a delivery truck's gonna come by and we need to have that space open. Well, people from outside of the town, they don't know that information. So working with the cities and the local businesses, we can start gathering that data, and then when we do parking solutions, we can help guide people through the proper place to park where they're not gonna upset the locals as well. We've done other projects with cities where we're using camera or optical sensor technology. We don't care about license plates, colors of cars, makes, or models. We're just looking at vehicles in and out of parking decks, for example, at the choke points. We don't even care about stall level, because we assume on some of the designs of these parking garages, they're gonna have to pass all the open spots anyways. So we're just concerned about the choke points and not keeping that data, but just doing raw counts so that we can give drivers alerts of space availability.
David, using the St. Augustine example, it occurs to me that I know St. Augustine probably has a very good handle on vehicular traffic. You track those. You're going to start knowing the bike and perhaps scooter flow of people. But pedestrians aren't probably tracked as well. So I know that David has done some work in that area. I also know that it could be a Bluetooth beacon system or Bluetooth low energy. It also could be the connected pedestrian using connected vehicle technology in your cell phone. That's a proxy for you. Have you done some work in that area?
I personally haven't, but there are other groups that are working in that area. But certainly there's a lot of sensors on the vehicle where we can understand what's going on and the ambient surroundings of that vehicle, and predict relative motion of those people and our vehicles, and determine whether or not there's a collision situation that might happen, and mitigate that situation from happening.
Yeah, where I was going was that I believe connected vehicle technology will also be shortly available in your phone.
Right.
So that within 100 meters, you'll be broadcasting your speed, direction, and location anonymously, and anyone within that short range will be able to read that. And ideally, it's the car converging on you while you're in the crosswalk that matters.
Yeah, and it's along those lines, it's fascinating too. I don't know if you all are familiar with Vision Zero programs, but it's just this effort for traffic engineers to reduce traffic deaths to zero, traffic deaths and crashes. We have 30 to 40,000 Americans killed every year in traffic crashes, and the vast majority are preventable. We like to think that we're great drivers, but it's interesting that the steady headlines about AV, CV work with pedestrians is you see if there's one potential accident, then that's going to hang up headlines, and that's what people are going to use as resistance for autonomous vehicles out in public. When in fact, people driving are the worst. We're the ones that right now that are killing each other in traffic. And it's because we're so easily distracted. I'm not even talking about looking at your phone. We forget what we're doing. I mean, academics have been studying this for decades, that we just aren't that great after about 30 seconds of driving. So as someone who walks quite a bit, I can't wait for that kind of technology to evolve where the cars will be so polite that they're gonna notice that I'm drifting towards the curb. Because, frankly, as a pedestrian, you should be aimless sometimes. You should be able to just be distracted and window shop or stare at the sky or stare at the other person across the street. That's human existence. So yeah, I can't wait for that kind of technology to protect us as people.
Well, we've only got a few minutes left, so can I ask are there any other questions from the audience? All right, so let me just ask. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I'm Sal Spada from ARC, and I have a question for David. I recently listened to an interview with the CEO of Ford, and he was talking about the plateauing of the automobile sales, and it was basically a function of the congestion in many of the urban areas. And so, we all think about the middle class increasing, and then, of course, more sales of automobiles. Can you kind of enlighten me in terms of, or us, in terms of where you think the plateau is in terms of the overall automobile sales, where they're going to plateau out? Is there a kind of a model you have at Ford that has investigated this?
Yeah, I don't want to contradict our CEO, plus. So it's also not really an area that I'm involved in, vehicle sales and so forth. But my own personal opinion is the industry is very cyclical. I was talking to Jim earlier about this. The industry is very cyclical, and so if you just talk about automotive in general, it's a sine wave, and over time that trough became wider. And so the industry started selling finance to offset that trough. But then 2008 time period, that trough, the two cycles intersected each other, and the troughs were really expanded outward, and the peak went down. And you have other countries and startups that have entered into the market, so the entry barriers have become lower. So now market share has decreased, and so your peak is narrowed, and your trough again widens, and the frequency is also increased. And then you build more reliable vehicles that last longer, so people hold on to them longer. So now your trough gets even wider. So there's a lot of different factors that are influencing where that volume plateaus out. That, along with the changing in sentiment of ownership versus pay for it as a service when I need it. People are starting to realize that they've purchased a high-end item that sits around 93% of the time, and that's changed. Will it go away completely? No, we're still going to need different types of transportation. It's not just cities, but rural areas will need different types of transportation as well. So it's not going to go away completely, but where it'll actually flatten out, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question, or.
No, it's fine. I just wanted a perspective, and if you had any internal models, I was interested mainly because we cover the automation industry. Where do we envision the continued investments in you talk about capital investments in plants and things of that nature, and so I was curious in how much more investment there would be in automotive production.
What we've seen and what you've probably heard on the news is that people are shifting more from sedans to larger vehicles, crossovers and trucks and so forth.
But that tends to be very cyclical and related
Right.
really to the pricing of oil and things. So it's not really I wouldn't consider it a long-term trend.
Right.
I think what your CEO was talking about more of a macro trend in terms of where that plateau was.
Right.
And
And that's really too what has driven us towards transforming from just a purely automotive company to a mobility company, and seeing that need and opportunity.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Sal.
All right, thanks.
Let's finish it up. I'm gonna ask Andy a final question. Just Andy, so what's the real comprehensive, compelling business case for mobility as a service?
From whose point of view? The customer point of view? Like me as just a regular person?
Yeah, as a citizen.
My perspective, I'm gonna project my own anecdotes on the entire free world. I think we want choice, we want freedom, we want convenience, and we want to be safe. I want those things. I know it's easy to wrap anything in the flag, but frankly, I think that's what we want. That's part of why cities were designed over 50 years ago to be for the automobile because we were promised this idea of freedom. And then it turns out we all clogged up the roads and we can't get anywhere. So that freedom aspect that was promised, we all wanted it. We still want it. We want to be able to go the places where we want to go. But it's that freedom of modal choice. Like if I'm so close, if I'm just within a few miles and I have an option for an easy bike, maybe it's an electric bike where I'm not going to even break a sweat. I want those choices. I want that freedom. And then that goes hand in hand with the convenience, like having those options nearby. And then the cost issue, thinking about things like minivans and SUVs that cost about $9,000 or $10,000 a year to park. And as we keep saying, they're parked the vast majority of the time. Half of our trips are really short trips. They're just less than a few miles. And I think it's 40% of trips still are under a mile, 1 mile. And over half are under 3 miles. That's an easy bicycle ride. And even if you just look in areas where we're starting to retrofit suburbia and do some infill projects, there's so many fantastic opportunities where we could access these places walking and biking. But as it is, we're forced to drive. So for those tiny little trips, so if you think 5% of our car's life, we're spending $9,000 to $10,000 a year to drive cars just a tiny fraction of time, these little distances, I am paying a fortune to go nowhere. I don't like that. So from mobility as a service point of view, as a customer, I can't wait, just like I made that switch with movies and CDs and to a degree groceries and some other things. I want to be able to, for a certain amount of money that I think is fair, tap into a library of shared things. I mean, for me, that's the business case as a customer and a consumer.
Wow, thanks, Andy. Oh, I think we got one last question.
This isn't a question. This is just I'll pass along some observations. I talked to a lot of Chris Davis, VP of Smart Cities at Simcom. I talked to a lot of cities, and when you talk about mobility, there are some other elements which I think are really important. You talked about accessibility, and they talk about it in a very broad sense. They talk about inclusion. They talk about connection to the community. And, a lot of mobility and micro mobility is focused on sort of last mile. If I'm a disadvantaged person, how do I get to the train, the bus line, whatever, right? Do I walk? I live in the Boston area, so there's a lot of bike share there, as you know. But I think the one thing that we don't think about so much is a lot of these initiatives are all about giving time back to people. And that's a commodity that is priceless, as we all know. So I just throw that out there as an observation from many conversations, synthesized from many different city officials and technologists. So time, it's all about time.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone out here in the audience, and most especially thank you for our panelists.